Okay, we're back. Welcome back to the Perception Action Journal Club. I'm happy to be joined again by Andrew and Marianne to dig through again our next episode on Michael Turvey's lectures on perception. Again, foreshadow, we got one more fairly tough chapter. And then, well, still tough, but
yeah,
a little more,
tough in a different way.
tough, but a little more grounded, literally, right? A little more tangible perception. Maybe you can picture yourself related to. So how are you guys doing? We're ready to, let's see. Okay, so we ended off last time talking about Descartes and mechanistic account.
Yes.
And that we're back on that in chapter 7. So lecture 7. Okay, so what is the biggest Andrew, where do you want to go from here? Where does he's picking up the same program? He's kind of contrasting. He's going to contrast a different view.
Yeah.
Into empiricism, which is getting a little closer to Gibson, talking about how we can perceive the world through our experience.
Well, so I was flicking back through my notes on the blog as well, and I realized that everything we've done so far up until the Cartesian program has been basically discussing rationalism.
Yeah.
Where rationalism is philosophically roughly is you need knowledge to figure things out, and that's how you get places. So the idea, where does perceptual experience come from? And for the rationalists, it comes from knowledge.
Yes.
Where generally that knowledge usually has to be given by something, and it's for Descartes and a lot of them it's God, right? So God sets it up so that you know stuff.
Yeah. We're at our loan on intelligence.
Yeah.
That's last time. Yeah.
And so then historically that gets contrasted with empiricism, which is the idea that, well, where does perceptual experience come from? It comes from our experiences. We learn everything. We learn some amount, right? And so people vary, and then it's almost like a nature-nurture thing, right? You've got rationalism here and empiricism here, and then people vary exactly where they are on the continuum.
Yeah.
And so I think my take on this is that Turvey's just rounding out the discussion, because everything so far has been about these rationalist approaches, and the big problem has been these loans of intelligence, and in particular the fact that they're generally unrepayable loans of intelligence. So in order to get something to work, somebody somewhere in the system, something needs to know something in order to be able to add it in.
Yes.
to enrich perceptual experience. And the question is always, where does that knowledge come from? And you have to borrow that from somewhere. That's your loan of intelligence. And then the question is, well, you just can't ever pay that back. Usually you have to go to the bank, as he describes it, make a withdrawal. But then there is this this other philosophical approach of, well, actually, no, it's not knowledge that gives you these things, it's experience. And so maybe actually that solves the problem. And then this chapter is basically showing that historically, at least, empiricism is still going to run into most of the same problems, because it's dealing with the same, it's all grounded in the same 17th century physics. And it's not rationalism that's the villain, it's 17th century physics. And so all the problems that come about are because of 17th century physics, and all the traditional empiricists who are Locke and Berkeley and Hume are all doing the same physics, and therefore running into basically the same problems. They're just running into them from the other direction.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good way to put it. Yeah, it goes through kind of each of their stances, Locke's, Berkeley's, and Hume's separately, and kind of shows Hume is the most extreme, I guess.
I think so.
Yeah. So the one, the one end of it is that we're passed down, whether genetically, knowledge. We're somehow, which is the nature argument.
Yeah.
And that's the one extreme. The other extreme is we build it up from perception. Yeah.
And it's funny. I saw on Blue Sky today, Paul Bloom was just posted a blog post, And he's a well-known cognitive psychologist, and he's literally posting a blog post about his opinions on whether or not nature versus nurture debates are still interesting. So it's like, one of the things in Turvey's book is he's raising all these old issues, and you have to go, well, why am I learning about all of this? And the point is, well, because it's still foundational to the way we do psychology.
Yes. No, that's a great point. I still every once in a while have that come up in some topic we're talking about. Someone asked me in sports, what degree is it when? What was a specific example? I got asked, why do the offspring of great athletes tend to be great athletes?
Right.
What extent is it genetics versus their environment?
Yeah.
There's a nature versus. Got asked that 2 days ago. So yeah, it's still relevant. Yeah.
So basically, we're dealing. So we've done nature. We're going to spend a bit of time on nurture.
Yeah, Marianne, what did you get overall from this?
So sorry, Snoopy's decided to bark. Very, very similar, and I think, like Andrew says, they're all trying to solve the problem of having to have low non-intelligence. They want to get rid of that. They recognize that as a major problem, but they're still trying to solve, as we would probably think, the wrong problem. And then when I think where we get to is actually we need to completely rethink the problem. And it's not that we've got this 17th century perspective of what it is to be perceived.
Yes.
And I think also this idea that there is a man in the room, that there isn't there's the separation. That's the other big bit, isn't it? They always talk about the man in the room, that the mind is definitely separate to the body, or the sense of self is separate to the body distinctly. So you can't have direct perception while you've got that. So I think there's two things for me, those stood out. The one is we need to recognize that the room is still the man. They're not separate. And that changes loads of things. And then think, okay, we need to get rid of this, the 17th century physics, and look at what would this problem be if we updated, our understanding to 21st century. Now we're solving a different problem. So I think that's my big overview.
Yeah, I think that's good. If we were going to put in a little nutshell, what is wrong? What specifically is wrong with traditional physics?
So
I'll let you go ahead.
So Turvey's trying to naturalize perception, and what that means is that he's trying to figure out a way for a physical system. He's trying to identify what kind of physical system could possibly be a perceiving action intentional system. And the problem with 17th century physics is that it gives you a set of properties, and it divvies them up in certain ways. So it says some things are primary qualities and some properties, and some are secondary properties. So the mass of an object is a primary property, and the color of it is secondary. And the mass is primary because it lives entirely in the rock, and if you never observed it, the rock would still have some mass. But something like color gets negotiated, and there's contributions from the rock, and there's contributions from the person and what the color experience, and so that's secondary. And so the big problem is that 17th century physics only really considers primary properties to be real. They're the real things you're allowed to build your physical systems out of. Everything else is psychological, mental/weird. And so the problem with 17th century physics is that if that's all you have, if those are the only kinds of building blocks that you have to build your physical system, then everybody's struggling to be able to build an intentional system out of those kinds of pieces. So Descartes can build an animal out of those kinds of things, but he can't build a human out of it, and that's why you have to have the soul, right? And so on and so forth. So yeah, and so that's the big problem. 17th century physics gives you an inadequate toolbox of properties that you can build stuff out of.
Is it also the Euclidean geometry? So that's the other bit that sits in there. So you've only got things like points, lines, angles, planes, etc. So those two combined being considered the information that the brain is receiving, again, through a misunderstanding of what the retina is, gives you basically it's those problems that we've got an image supposedly on the retina, it's upside down, it doesn't have any information that is use. Yeah. So that's where the problems come from. So that's the problem they're trying to solve, which is where we get to is actually they're still trying to solve the wrong problem, essentially.
Mhm.
Actually, yeah, and geometry is a good one as well because it's the other thing that science and maths, importantly, that's the other thing that maths gives you. Maths lets you talk about things like primary properties, but it doesn't let you talk about secondary properties.
Yeah.
So, and maths is the key tool here. So that's one thing. And then, as Marianne says, one of the things that maths gives you is Euclidean geometry, which for thousands of years was the only geometry, and it's pretty impressive and does all kinds of things. So everybody was like, "We've solved geometry." And I don't think it's until the 20th century where somebody goes, "Actually, do you know what? I can come up with another one." And then somebody goes, "Oh, actually, there's another one over here," and all of a sudden, there's lots of perfectly consistent and coherent geometries.
Yeah, we're gonna get into that. That's a lot next chapter, right?
That's big for space perception. Yeah, but you're right.
I was trying to think about
the other
this.
tool that's struggling. Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking about this myself in the relative. I've been teaching perception right now, perception class, and talking about the correspondence problem.
Mm-hmm.
Right, correspondence problem is how do I match one static retinal image to the next one when something's moving? Like that's a problem. Is that really a problem? That's a problem when we frame it in terms of kind
Images.
of images and static. Yeah. So it's not really a problem for the brain to solve at all. It really, if you look at it a different way. So yeah, I think that's a really important point. But it's all like framing and asking the right how we ask the right question. Is this a problem or not? No, right? It's not. I've got a few responses. People are like pushing back on, this is not a book that's giving you evidence for like why perception should be direct. I don't think.
Not yet.
So much. It's more what it means to be direct. It's clarifying it, right?
Or what we need for perception. What perception needs to give us in order to be effective to move in the world.
Yeah.
Yes. So notice that the book's called Lectures on Perception, not Lectures on Gibson.
Yes.
But it's an ecological perspective, but it's about everything we've done right now is trying to articulate the problem and trying to articulate it using a certain set of tools and then taking those tools for a run and seeing what happens and finding that we keep running into the same problems. So yeah, absolutely. Like at the moment that, yes, we don't yet have evidence for direct perception.
Yeah.
What we have is a long laundry list of actually insurmountable and unavoidable problems for indirect perception. Yeah. Which is half of the story.
Yeah. Yeah. Is it worth? I think in 7 he talks about one of the problems was that what difference people are concerned with. So it was it's the geometrists and the physicists that are thinking about what there is to be perceived. And then it's the philosophers and the psychologists and the physiologists when they came that were thinking about how it works and how things are perceived, and they're totally separate. So taking basically one field that, like you say, is maybe not the information that actually matters to movement, and then trying to use that in another field that's completely disconnected.
Yeah, and it's funny. So I'm teaching on a cognitive module at the moment, and I've just done some lectures on perception and then action and affordances. And the lecture, the perception lecture, like I had to try and convince a bunch of students, psychology students, that talking a little bit about physics was actually an important first step. And I always have to have the conversation about, well, why am I talking about this, right? Why aren't we, why aren't I talking about brains? Why aren't I talking about other things? Why am I talking about what's out in the world? And I was, again, this was on my mind, and I've done this a few times, and I keep trying to find ways to talk them into noticing that it matters. I won't know how well it's gone until they write me some essays, but,
Yeah. Would you do? Sorry, Anu, go ahead. Would you say this is fair? Like, traditional physics is giving us a neutral, intent, goal-free description of the world.
Yes.
And if you start with that, then you have to kind of solve a lot of problems to get to your goal from this.
Yes.
Whereas Gibson is going to flip it on its head for something like ecological optics. He's going to put the goal and the intent in the physics itself, right? He's going to link them together directly. And Yeah.
One of the
Sorry.
other things that's really clear, though, is that there have been hundreds of years of serious people banging their heads against this. And they're like, these were not stupid people, right? So the fact that it didn't occur to them, like the reason, or one of the reasons it didn't occur to them to do anything different is that they didn't actually think that there was a different way of doing it, right? They were deeply impressed by physics. And they should have been, because physics and mechanics was doing all like it was enabling astonishing things, right? In terms of describing and predicting and controlling the environment, for example, right? Like if you want to build a bridge, you better get that particular kind of physics right, or else the bridge is going to fall down, and so, yeah, like it almost seemed like they were like, well, the physicists are doing this wonderful, the physics is doing this wonderful job of actually telling us what's out there. Well, that's obviously the starting point.
Yeah.
And we're going to have to cope with the problems. And it's like, it's a dynamical systems problem, right? So if you have a dynamical system that's trying to do something but failing and destabilizing, if it has nowhere to go, then it just disintegrates, right? It doesn't magically produce something else unless there's an option, right?
Yeah.
And there simply was no option. Nobody had a working theory of what direct perception could possibly even look like, as far as I know, until Gibson proposed information.
Yeah, all those words I just used to describe neutral, those are positives in some sense, right? For physics, that's what you want. Judgment-free description of the world is what we want. It was very successful. So yeah, I think that. So I think, Sorry, Marianne.
Yeah, no, and I think the mind-body dualism still causes problems, because even, I on a webinar the other week, we were sort of exploring the difference between sort of more cognitive and ecological perspectives. And as soon as, I said, it's an organism environment relationship rather than just the organism, I'm like, well, does that mean the brain doesn't have anything to do with it? It's just like they can't imagine that, but it still is, because they've separated it. There's this I think in so many things that we do, and maybe in a lot of pop psychology and things like that as well, in the brain so much that it's just so imbued in everyday thinking and language. And when you're stuck with that, you're less likely to move away from, well, maybe it's not, Newtonian physics and Euclidean geometry that an organism needs to perceive. Because you've already got one of the things that takes you or allows you to be led up that path, haven't you? Which is that separation. A computer that's doing something separate from a body.
Yes, absolutely. And yeah, it was interesting actually in the Cartesian program chapter. Descartes basically laid out a program that modern information processing psychology is following, and all they've done is they've swapped out the technologies and things that Descartes was doing, and just swapped in computers. And that was the exciting thing about computer theory, was that it is actually kind of powerful, and it was certainly the right kind of thing. Like somebody figuring out the various theories of computing and information theory, they were creating a formal mathematical language that definitely had the kind of, at least at the beginning, looked like it might have the kind of capabilities of solving these kinds of problems. So it was, again, it was a good faith effort.
Yeah, and I think so. So if I was sort of just looking back on this, so if we're going to kind of summarize, so I maybe mentioned a large part of this chapter, he's talking about empiricism, kind of the limitations of empiricism. For me, one of I guess the way I describe it is, the pure experience can't give you knowledge of the world, partly because of all the issues we're talking about. What's missing is specification, and right, that's what's missing in here. Right? If we describe the world by images and traditional, then there's not direct links between what you're perceiving and what's out there. So you can't gather up understanding of the world through just experiencing it through this lens anyway. So I just got to. So he spends a lot of time describing the limitations of empiricism.
Mhm.
Well, but I think that's kind of the brunt of it.
So he does. Right. So he then does another thing that's been quite common, where he sort of he flags something up that we're going to talk about in more detail later on. Right. So he has this section called a mystery and a glimpse ahead, and the glimpse ahead is basically towards 21st century physics, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the big problem. Right. Let me just go back to the beginning here. At the beginning of the lecture, we've got this mechanistic kind of 17th century physics, and the problem with it is that the sort of the axioms or the five main assumptions of that approach are basically that matter is really boring. Material stuff is not interesting. There's no intentionality. There's no life. It's inert. It doesn't do anything by itself, and that's kind of baked into it. And so then he then does the thing. Well, okay. One of the things we're going to rely on later on is the fact that actually, like, just material interactions can be quite interesting in sort of interesting kind of ways. And so he points to a couple of examples that are the kind of like, it's nonlinear dynamics and weird chemistry, right? Where you get these chemical reactions that are self-sustaining and self-organizing and remain slightly out of balance with the world, which means they keep cycling and so on and so forth. And that's like, if you showed that if you explained that chemistry, that chemical reaction to Descartes or Hume, they would think you were talking madness, right? It would just be like, what are you talking about, right? Everything you've just said makes no sense. Like, there must be something in there moving it, right? But yeah, so he's doing it just again. He's doing the thing of just he's dropping something in, and it's not really counting as evidence yet.
Yeah. So he's kind of picking up, and again, he's appealing to quantum physics.
Does he, with this, then he starts to appeal to the fact that actually this idea that all the material things in the whole of the environment is completely inert is also a problem, because animals are influencing their environment through their interaction, which is the active
quantum
matter
idea, right?
Yeah.
That's the thing to be explained, right? If all your material stuff is inert and boring, where does animacy and intention come from? Well, it's clearly not contained. None of the properties of the material thing give you intentionality.
Yeah.
And so that's why you keep being unable to build a physical system that can do it. It has to be a mixed physical
and mentally. Mentally, yeah.
Yeah. So, is there anything? We pretty much cover everything in this chapter. Or is there anything else we need to pull out? I think this is kind of the last kind of preliminary one, and putting just showing the limitation of the mechanistic hypothesis. No matter whether you apply it in terms of rationalism or empiricism, it's still not going to work. Something different.
I found the section on correspondence, coherence, and pragmatic theories of truth quite hard work. So it was one of the things that was quite to overview that. I kind of get through it and go, it's sticky.
So, right. Okay. So those are right. For the empiricist to take, our man in the room is receiving these sensory impressions and is trying to learn from them. And so the question is how, like on what basis can you rely on, or in what ways can you rely on these things? What can they possibly tell you? And so that's the truth that he's talking about. What's the truth of these things? How do you get to what's actually out in the world, given you have these sort of sensations effectively happening to you? And so there's people have tried three ways of doing it, right? Correspondence, coherence, and pragmatism. So correspondence is the idea that you could assume that the sensations you're receiving correspond to something real out in the world. And the problem, and if you could assume that, then you'd be off to the races, right? But the problem is you can't count on it,
No.
given the kind of sensations that are coming in, and also you can't check it, right? So you can't check to see whether or not you've got the right correspondence relationship because you can't step out of the room, right?
Yeah.
So it's a great idea in theory, but in practice it doesn't get you anywhere. And so you just end up with sort of a problem. So then people go, well, okay, well, what about coherence, right? You don't necessarily, you've got all these sensations, and you don't know necessarily what they correspond to, but you know that they have a coherence. So when you have this pattern, you always have this pattern, or the relationships between patterns of things kind of holds together, and that's okay as well.
I did read into that it kind of sounded like it was an almost inside your head, sort of echo chamber. You could end, if you took that to its extreme, that if
Yes.
things that you agree with what you've already experienced and what you already think, then that means they're true.
Yeah. So I was looking at my notes again, and you do end up with kind of sort of solipsism, where you can end up building your experience out of the coherence of things, but just because something's coherent doesn't mean it actually corresponds to something out there. So you're building something that's consistent, but you have no idea if it means anything.
Right.
Is a problem. And then pragmatism is basically just going, well, if it works, if it's stupid but it works, then it isn't stupid, basically. But then you have to figure out, well, what does working mean? And that usually means you're going to have to fold something like action in.
Yeah.
And none of these theories yet talk about action. None of them think that action has to be a part of perception. They're not solving the grounding problem with action.
Yeah.
So I was reminded, again, I was looking at my notes. I was reminded again that actually this analysis is kind of funny, because it's actually the analysis that Hoffman works his way through when he was developing interface theory.
Okay.
And he comes up with these various strategies of ways of building perceptual interfaces. And some of them are about correspondence, and some of them are about coherence, and some of them, and he does eventually try to ground his in a kind of pragmatism through action, right? So it was kind of funny to see it lay out and to sort of show up again. And the thing that interface theory does is it latches onto one of these notions, ends up in a silly place, and then Hoffman just goes, well, that's just the problem that we're faced with. We have the silly problem, and interfaces are the solution, as opposed to going, no, actually, you've still got a problem. But it was just, it sat right on top of his analysis, right? So again, that was just kind of nice to see, because it was interesting just to see it crop up again.
Yeah. Yeah.
In basically exactly the same shape.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, obviously meaning is going to be, again, Gibson's, that's a huge thing for him, that it conveys meaning. So correspondence would be, that's almost getting into direct perception, right? Correspond, what you perceive, realism, I guess. What you perceive corresponds to one particular event in the world, the sensation you get.
I think so. So you're you're assuming that there is that realism. So you kind of, you count on there being something else.
You don't know whether it's.
Yeah. And then you assume that the things that you are receiving correspond to a real thing.
Mm-hmm.
And you just, and on the basis of that, you just get up and running. And that's how you establish that something is true, is that you just kind of go, well, it's just true. That's why it's true. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess would Turvey's example of the sun rising be an example of that? That has correspondence, but it's not.
Yeah,
it's not actually what it is, or maybe, I don't know. I found hard parsing exactly what the difference between these two means. Coherence is more like there's a nice relationship. When something changes, my sensation changes accordingly.
And if something similar happens, I get something similar happens again. That was what I read from that. That there's this sort of coherence,
some reliability to it. Yeah. But all these are kind of,
Obviously, one of the things that I was interested in was I think it's Berkeley is the only one who was trying to come up with, for him, something that worked for all animals, whereas
Yes.
who just didn't care, did they? It's like, then he said, but one of the, like a test of whether this works is that it will work for all animals.
Yes,
Humans. I thought that was quite interesting.
Yeah, that's Hume's touchstone. He describes it as like later on he talks about I think the empiricists were happier with the idea that whatever we figure out has to be true across the whole animal kingdom. Yes.
So philosophically, we had that the empiricism, idealism, and skepticism. To the three of them. Yeah.
Basically.
A little bit of a short philosophy.
Yes.
History of philosophy chapter. Yeah.
Can't help getting into that a little bit.
Yeah. I'm trying to see if I've got any other notes.
Yeah, I don't have too much more on this one. It is. I like your blog posting. It's getting grumpy. You're getting grumpy with Turvey a little bit. This has been pretty tough.
Trying to it's funny because Turvey writes in this way where he lays out all this information, but he never tells you what the point is.
Yeah.
So whenever I read these chapters, I go in and I try and find what each chapter is about.
Mm-hmm.
But I have to go find it, and it's not always clear at all because he'll talk about 3 or 4 different things, and it's not at all immediately obvious why they are related.
100%.
At all.
Yeah. That's what I find hard in our discussions, especially the last few, parsing it in a logical way where we can discuss it. I find incredibly difficult. But I think you wrote in your post too, and I think part of it is, again, these are lectures, so it's probably a little bit discuss what does this mean. Like, I think that's partly rather than this is a traditional chapter.
Well, I guess that's kind of what we're doing here, right? It's like, we're like the discussion group after Turvey's given the lecture, right? We've gone to the pub. We're trying to figure out.
We just need Turvey here to say, no, you're way off.
Yeah. My last notes on this were that Hume's touchstone identified the counterfeit any account of perception. It doesn't apply even-handedly to humans and non-human animals, but that he, again, like you said, that there was no meaning in that sort of mechanical mind, didn't have meaning, didn't have intentionality. So it's like, then the problem is, how do you get intentionality into it?
Yeah, and you just can't. Like, it's one thing I did like about this was just seeing over and over and over and over and over again people trying what look in some ways like very different approaches, but because they're using the same tools, they dig the same hole, right?
And he talks about that. Some of that was they've got the linear, dynamics, and he said you need the non-linear thermodynamics, non-linear dynamics, and non-locality in the sort of quantum physics. If you don't have that, then you always get stuck. They keep getting in the same place.
And even Turvey's gonna say that we need all those things, but even if he's wrong about that, and this turns out to be the wrong physics, his bigger point kind of stands, which is just that if you're going to study perception, you actually do need to know a little bit about the theory of physics that gives you your set of things to be perceived.
Yeah.
And set of things you're allowed to build your organism out of. Because it turns out that that's actually really important to your theory, to your psychological theory, right? Yeah. And that physics can get more interesting and more complicated and in interesting kinds of ways. So we've got some new tools now potentially, and they look like they might be the right kinds of things, and they give us some interesting kinds of things. So let's pursue this for a while, but you only make the switch if you know that you have to make the switch, right? Because and very obviously that's the case because most of psychology has not made the switch because it doesn't know that it's got this problem.
Mhm.
So almost, even if Turvey's wrong about these particular physical principles being the ones that are going to actually be great, at least just reminding us that we have to engage with it is actually, it's quite an important service, really. And
Yeah,
and
for
that's, and again, and think about, and Gibson's, what is it, the first four chapters, I think, of the 79 book are all what's out there to be perceived before he
Mhm.
even talks about the organism doing the perceiving, right? What's the
Yes.
nature of the ecologically scaled physical world, right?
Yeah. Or the regularities of the physical
yeah.
world. Yeah.
And no one else does that.
No. Strangely, most perception ignores the outside world that we're trying to perceive. Like,
Yep.
most
Perception begins on the retina, where the
yeah,
processing begins.
it's all what's going on in the head, the
Mhm.
inference, and we just kind of take it for granted. Yeah, I guess this leads. Should we skip to the next chapter? So next chapter,
Yeah.
lecture 8, the space enigma.
That's
This one I we're done with the preliminaries. I like this one because it's really getting into
Yeah.
this is where I was when I first encountered direct perception. I was studying binocular vision and these kind of different things, and this is brings out one of the main kind of thrusts of, I guess, for me, one of the things people throw as why we need indirect perception, because we live in a 3D world and we have a 2D
Mhm.
input to our perceptual system.
Yep.
How could we possibly infer what's out there without doing some processing or knowledge or something? Because we starting with this impoverished representation of what's out there,
Mhm.
and I know that's not exactly all he's talking about, but that's kind of jumped out at me. That's a fundamental problem that put people into come more in direct terms.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
So,
the retinal image, and as I mentioned, Gibson is going to turn this. I like this chapter because it works kind of. It's pushing you when we get ecological optics. The idea of that moving in that direction, which is getting exciting. We're getting to concrete things. Yeah. So we're talking about perception of space, the layout of the world.
Yep. And this is where Euclidean geometry comes in.
Yes.
Yeah, nicely. So.
Yeah.
And there's of course other geometries we could use. Most of us don't understand any of them. They're very pretty complicated.
Yeah.
Affine geometry, topologies,
Yeah.
but it's
so it's this idea, and the image is flat. It's ambiguous. So it's in respect to size and form, ambiguous in respect to relative sizes, forms of component parts, and it's inverted and reflected. So again, we've got flipped because they would take the retina off when they had to look and then put a mirror behind it. It's really interesting. But I think when you start looking at some of those, again, when I read that, it reminded me of I can't remember which. It was one of the earlier chapters, when you talked about if you dismantle a bicycle, it'll be different if you take the wheels off and things like that compared to if you take a, a
blowtorch.
If you use a wrench versus a blowtorch.
It's like, so,
No, I think it's fundamentally, if you have look out and you see a surface, how do you? Its image size and orientation depends on how far away it is, there's no unique correspondence between the 2G projection of an image of an object and the object.
And
it's in the basic physics description.
Yeah, and so that gets us back. I think it's the projective assumption from a couple of chapters back. The idea that the basis of visual perception is to be found in the way in which the world is projected onto the retina.
Yes.
And the rules governing that projection, and Euclidean geometry is one of the ways you can do that. Obviously, then there's other kinds of perspective geometry and things like that. Where and developing those gives you the ability to draw really realistic pictures of 2D pictures of things, right, with space in the image. And so that's the other thing that's going on here is that again, they're not just making this stuff up. They're sitting on definite successes of these mathematical systems, right? They're looking at, people have worked out all kinds of laws of projection and how these things work. And if you use those rules, then you can produce a really detailed 2D image of a 3D landscape that conveys that's like, you get that sense of depth and you get that sense of space. Obviously not all of it. It's not the same as perceptual experience, but there's all kinds of things you can put into a picture, that make it look like it has depth. And so they're looking at this going, well, look, right, there's all these geometrical and importantly, that means they're mathematically expressible principles. So they're trying to get everything that's real is mathematically expressible, right? So there's all these rules that you can express using mathematics that will in fact get you from a flat 2D surface to an impression of depth. Isn't that cool? And they're like, yeah, that's great, right? Well, they're looking for the thing that tries to solve the problem that they're up against, and there have been some successes. So they're sitting on top of this. But I guess the other thing in this chapter is, so there's going to be multiple attempts, right? There's several Space Enigma lectures, right? And so there's multiple attempts to try and figure out what's required to get the 2D projection onto the retina to be informative about depth and distance and space, etc. And so the big focus in this chapter is, laying out the problem of space perception going from 2D to 3D using the flatland analogy, and then starting with Berkeley and talking about his initial suggestion about using movement and action and touch.
Yeah, and I think that's probably worth expanding on a bit, isn't it? Because the idea that you can use one sense to link to another one to add that information, and if we move around, then just by through the action of moving, we are within a space, and so we're exploring that space, and by touching things we can feel the like how big they are. And again, so those two things, movement within an environment and touch, are giving space, aren't they? Do some examples. I think before we go there, if you're right, because again I tend to get like a pull into bits around other species, and it made me smile because everything I've been taught about the way horses see, particularly, they can't see, they haven't got any depth perception. Pretty good depth perception. Only a tiny bit in front of them where their eyes overlap, because our depth perception comes from the fact that we've got two front-facing eyes. What do they call it? Stereopsis. I can't pronounce it. Stereopsis. And again, he brings up this idea that actually this needs to be something that works for all organisms and all animals, that even if they haven't got the same type of eye as us, like a fly, for example, having different eyes, and animals that clearly are able to navigate complex 3D, even animals that can fly might not have two eyes facing forwards, but they can still perceive depth, and they can actually move around in a much more complex 3D world than we can. So again, that setting up of like whatever we have has got to work across these different areas. We can't just have a theory that only works for humans and only works if you've got two eyes in front of you. Facing forwards.
In my class, I always do that. I'm like, oh my God, the world's flat. How am I going to get out of this room? Right? It doesn't work.
I do the same thing.
I possibly get out of this room now.
This is not right.
Yeah.
So I get them. So I go. Look, we're just talking about binocular versus monocular now. So what's the thing that everybody knows about?
You say, but it's like word association.
And everybody goes,
two eyes.
You lose depth perception. And I go, right, everybody, take your damn hand and do that.
And you say, well, try to thread a needle. Maybe then you'll have a trouble then. But most things you won't even notice, other than your visual field just reducing.
Yeah. Smaller. And the other thing is they say, oh, well, they're colorblind, they can't see any colors because they're colorblind, like somebody who's red green. I'm like, well, I'm red green colorblind, and every picture I see of this is the world of horses, and this is the world of human sees, and I'm like, it's the same to me.
Not all humans. Some of us only have limited vision on that front.
They're identical. So I'm like, okay, so the only difference between a horse's perception is that they can see around the corners, around the back. They've got no depth perception apart from a tiny bit in front of them, and they've got the same color vision as me. I don't think so. I was just like, that's still what we're taught. Like that is.
This is a key point, Mary. Like I think it's kind of like the assumption that job of perception is to recover the properties of the outside world. Like color. It doesn't matter. You know how hard it is to make two things equal just where they differ in color. almost everything in the world that differs in color differs in luminance too.
Mhm.
So you can tell difference between courses can tell difference between objects without being able to see the difference in color, right? So you don't need to perfectly recover color. Like
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
the same as space. We don't need to be perfectly recover every distance and length and whatever to operate in the world.
Well, we do need, under some circumstances, you need it to be pretty precise, right? When I reach for my coffee, my tea mug, right? Like there is metric shape perception that's going to be
Mhm.
quite, like I have to scale my hand appropriately, for example, and I do that ahead of time. And so there is going to have to be some way at some point of getting pretty precise. Not just where things are relative to one another, not just the ordinal stuff, but the actual metrics of space. So we're obviously not brilliant at the detailed metrics out at longer distances, but obviously, you know,
within your printer person,
two eyes, right? Within reach distance or within 1 step plus reach distance, like we actually have to be pretty good at it. So it is going to it's going to be a challenge. Like we're going to have to the precision with which we can actually. Or the precision with which we do seem to perceive visual space is going to have to be accounted for at some point.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah,
we need to be able to thread that needle eventually.
Yeah, at some point. Yeah.
So, should we start? Should we talk about Flatland and Spaceland?
Sure. Yeah.
So, shall I talk about Flatland?
Yeah. Well, give us an introduction. Yeah.
So.
I like the way you and I just nodded, Rob.
Yeah, we're like, okay, sure.
Well, because it is useful, right? And the thing about it is that it builds some nice intuitions that are going to be handy later on. And so this is a book by a guy, Abbott, called Flatland. And it's, right. So it actually presents a number of the problems that perception has to face under this kind of account in a nice kind of interesting way. So the story of Flatland is that there's this two-dimensional world, right? And there's the men and the women on this two-dimensional world. The women are all lines and the men are all polygons of various complexity. Like they have varying numbers of size. And, you know, the more size you have, the more important you are, right? But everything's sliding around on a plane. So when they
about the women being a line.
Look, I mean, it was written in 1884.
Reminds me of the early Atari games I used to play. Yeah, early computer graphics and video games. Yeah. I had an adventure. I remember a game you had an adventure. Your character was a square. That was your character. Sorry. Yeah.
No, it's true, right? But basically, when two inhabitants of Flatland meet up with each other, all they can see of each other is a line, actually. And so you actually don't know what you've got until you do a little bit of exploring. But you can still only do that exploring in 2 dimensions. And so there's 3 stories in Flatland in the book. And in the first one, so there's also Lineland, which is a 1-dimensional world, and there's Spaceland, which is a 3-dimensional world. And our hero, the square, lives in Flatland. And his first adventure is that he's interacting with an inhabitant of Lineland, and he's trying to talk them into the idea that there is such a thing as a second dimension. Because, and he knows it's true because he lives in it and he experiences 2 dimensions, but they don't, and they don't experience it, and they cannot experience it because there is no second dimension in their world. Mm-hmm. And he tries to talk them into it. So this is kind of the rationalist approach of just providing the knowledge, right? Mm-hmm. And the first thing that happens is he fails completely. He is unable to convince, using logic and reason, the inhabitants of Lineland that a second dimension even exists, right? And because they're asking questions like, well, where is it? Right? I can't point to it.
Yeah.
You know, there's nothing for me to point to. So then but then our hero learns nothing from this, because in the next adventures, somebody from Spaceland comes, right? This 3-dimension object comes and tries to convince our hero that there is such a thing as a 3rd dimension. And the square is like, what are you talking about, man? There's no such thing. It doesn't make any sense. Because his experience, I think the Spacelander, I think, is a sphere. And as the sphere passes through Flatland, all the Flatlander sees is a series of circles of changing size, right? as the sphere passes through, he doesn't ever see the third dimension of the sphere. He just sees a bunch of two-dimensional shapes. He's like, well, the only thing going on is what's in my experience. So the Spacelander can't talk him into the third dimension. And then let's see. But then right. So this gets us into Berkeley, right? He eventually gets talked into thinking that there could possibly be such a thing as a third dimension, but only by the miracle of being brought into Spaceland and being able to show. So he gets turned into a three-dimensional shape.
Mm-hmm.
So again, like only experience, only like you can't knowledge your way into knowledge of the third dimension, right? And then the Flatlander tries to talk the Spacelander and think, well, what if there's 4 dimensions in the space? Like, what are you talking about?
Yeah, that's crazy.
And then they all go home, right? So basically, the idea is that if you live in a 2-dimensional world, you can't knowledge your way into experience of a third dimension.
Yeah.
Right. You might be able to abstractly come to grips with the notion, but you can't experience it through just being talked into it. So so the only way to get brought into it is with the miracle of being brought into the 3-dimensional thing. And that brings us to Berkeley, right? As the first person here that we're discussing, trying to figure out how do you go from the 2D retina to the 3D experience of the world. And the retina is our Flatlander, and the Spacelander that saves us is movement. It's the touch system. It's the body because our body has no choice. Like our body is intrinsically 3-dimensional in the same way that the retina is intrinsically 2-dimensional. And so it's a Spacelander. And so what it does, Berkeley suggests, is it's effectively the thing that comes and gets visual experience and draws it out into the third dimension. So that's why the book's quite interesting, because it actually lays out all the ideas and all the problems and the challenges, and then it makes sort of Berkeley's suggested solution. You go, oh, that's what touch is doing, right?
Yeah.
It's the magical being that comes and saves you.
Yeah, I think that's a really good description. Yeah, I like that. So the fundamental idea is, one of them is, if I have a 2D retina, there's no way I can experience myself. Someone has to come down and say, hey, maybe it's Leonardo da Vinci in my head. Listen, those are all projections from a 3D world.
Right.
There has to be some intelligence.
Yes.
Telling me what I'm seeing. I can't. There's no. Otherwise, I would never.
And Berkeley thinks he's found a place to make that loan in an okay way, and at least initially, he thinks borrowing from the intrinsic 3-dimensionality of the touch system is going to be okay. He's wrong.
So
that's what he thinks.
Yeah. So I think this is an interesting point. The touch.
Yeah.
So touch is going to help us because of its proximal sense, with no projection in the same sense.
Right.
You can.
At least that's the idea. Yeah.
They're actually sort of, but
there's that mechanistic immediate.
Yes.
Which
literally mechanical experience, right?
Mechanical experience, yeah.
So it's not a bad idea. Right? Berkeley gets a bit of a bad rap, but actually it's not a crazy idea.
They're both getting into dynamics as the solution, right? Exploration, information across time instead of a static, which you get both from touch and movement, right? If you left the square, like if the 2-dimensional guy could walk all the way around, or go out and touch, then you get multiple.
Yeah. So but this all then sets on the idea that touch is that touch can ground vision. That touch is somehow. This is what I'm saying. So Berkeley's making a loan of intelligence, and he's borrowing it from the body, but he thinks it's okay because he thinks that the body is a place where that intelligence actually can come from, because everybody's kind of on board with the idea that touch is, what does Turvey call it? Incorrigible, right? That it's almost direct, right? That's this mechanical Yeah, so there must be a sensory source of ideas that is unequivocal about distance, size, and situation, right? And the suggestion is that that's what touch is, because touch feels like it should work differently to vision.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And the problem, of course, is that it doesn't really fundamentally. It still trades in information, and that's all Turvey's dynamic touch stuff. But nobody knows that yet. Everybody thinks, well, no, it's literally mechanical. It's that thing that I desperately wanted to be able to ground my theory. Like, isn't that great?
I can really see when you look at the history and where it's coming from, you can see that you must have thought, epiphany.
Yeah.
And then the movement bit as well. And I think, is this where he talks about the fact that it's not just us physically moving within the world, but it's also the fact that we move our head, our eye muscles move. There's other things, there's lots of other movements involved rather than just on the very sort of, global scale. There's smaller movements, and that those things would give us information about, how far away something is or how close it was.
Yeah. In modern parlance, he's invented cue combination. Actually, each of these things is a cue.
Yeah.
A cue to depth, right? This is
solving. Yeah.
This remains the damn traditional solution to depth perception: is you have a whole bunch of cues from a whole bunch of sources, and you combine them. I don't know. These days you do it doing Bayes theory, right? Because that's the best way to combine information, and you combine them, and that's how you get to it. But again, so there's two things there. One is that he's taking a perfectly respectable approach, and B, it is, in fact, exactly the approach still being taken by the vast majority of people studying perception, right?
Yes, for sure.
Yeah, good point. Yeah. So where do we get to then?
Yeah, so I don't know. Yeah, so he's kind of solving. Yeah, it's kind of satisfying. You're solving this knowledge of prior knowledge with experience from a different sense and a different. So it's a much more satisfying than some. Maybe let's be so. The idea of touch, why people thought touch was the solution. Obviously, you're in direct contact with the. Maybe we could talk a little bit. Is people consider it to be a completely different sense in the same, but the same sense. Then people went on to think of your fingertips are like your retinal image, right? So it's kind of So why do we? What is wrong? I guess what is wrong with these two solutions? I guess.
Right.
Yeah, that's what. Maybe we should go next. Yeah. Why doesn't this solve the problem?
Well, so it doesn't work. Well, it's funny. In some ways, it ends up right at the very end that there's still a problem that Berkeley blames on God. So that's one issue thing to notice.
It's still trying to perceive the same things, which is the physics and the geometry rather than affordances.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
So actually that's a good way to think about it. This is not a solution to the intentionality problem.
No.
This is potentially a solution to the flatland
projection. Yeah.
The issue of 2D projection.
Yeah. How do we get
yeah, that's actually really important, Marianne. There's no notion of meaning here yet. Just recovery of physical structure.
We're asking the wrong questions again, right? We're trying to solve something that.
And so Turvey does review some recent experiments around like blind walking, right? And so you can get someone to close their eyes and you can get them to walk or jog with some assistance so they don't run into anything, a set distance. And then you get them to turn around, open their eyes and walk back until they think until they've traversed the same distance. And actually people are reasonably good at this. But this actually raises a problem Turvey identifies, is that you've got two different modes of moving, but then informing a different mode of, so like walking and running both inform walking backwards. And so the question is, like, you've got two very different bodily experiences producing the same behavior at the end, the same apparently the same experience of space as measured by your walking back. And so that's complicated. And then, what is it? So, and these and some other experiments kind of point to the fact that even though there do seem to be invariants of experience going on, and that these sensors can, well, as we would say now, that these things can calibrate each other, they're not, they don't calibrate each other by virtue of the fact that the bodily movement is somehow producing definitely the right answer all the time. Because actually it's always giving you different information too. But you can still use that somehow to recover, to perceive an experience space. So they're not, in any obvious sense, he says, incorrigible sources of ideas of distance. It's not. It's like it's basically bodily experience seems like it might be the kind of thing that could give you access to the third dimension, but it doesn't give you access in a way. Once you nut through the details, it doesn't actually give you access to it in a way that could actually help tell you what's going on, because the bodily experience itself is too variable. And then right at the end, Berkeley basically goes, well, okay, this doesn't work, and so there's probably some God going on to help solve it. And again, we've just run into exactly the same issue.
Yeah.
And again, he does this with some different animals, doesn't he? With arachnids, and there's another one. I can't remember what the other animal was actually from there. They do a bit where they actually, what do? They do something with the spider. Oh yeah, there's spiders that have some little slits on their legs that they find if they're covered, they can't get their way back. They just randomly wander around to the same distance, but not to the right place.
Right.
So that's something that's on one of the spider's legs, I think, the organ. So it starts to link into these other, like again, it's a problem that's solved in so many different ways.
Yeah. So this is it, right? So in some ways, Turvey points out, in some ways, the fact that bodily movements and the bodily sensors that are tracking movement, the fact that they do seem to enable us to do these spatial feats does seem to relate quite nicely to Berkeley's hypothesis, right? So he says, right, that the evidence that locomotion without benefit of vision constitutes an instrument for measuring distance is favorable to Berkeley's hypothesis. But then he goes, but at the same time, actually, it doesn't work quite well because there's so much variation in the bodily experience producing the same results. It's not clear what the mapping is and how these things are relating to one another. And then, of course, in the modern stuff, when you actually start looking at how touch and proprioception and haptic perception actually works, this is all Turvey's dynamic touch stuff. It turns out that haptics and proprioception is itself a perceptual system that takes information, but the medium of that information isn't light or the air, but it's the tensegrity structure of the body, right? And so that's going to really, we haven't even got to that, but that really blows it out of the water, because if the way you're perceiving your body is also having to go through the same kind of things that vision does, then it can't be the solution to vision's problems, because it's got all the same problems with vision.
Yeah, you just start to find that actually you've got multiple problems to solve.
Yeah.
Rather than one of them being the answer to the other one.
Yeah.
Are we touching on embodiment here a little bit, embody perception a little bit? Like one of the problems with the walking, like if I do blind walking while I'm tired, right? Yeah. It's gonna probably I'm gonna give a different answer turning around and walking back with vision than if I'm not.
I think so. So there are all there's all kinds of.
It's not a perfectly gonna give you the sensation you're getting, not gonna be constant for the same physical distance.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's not like a ruler that you can that kind of Berkeley. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's starting to. Yeah, and that embodiment is starting to merge the mind and the body.
Mm-hmm.
The embodiment does, so that you haven't got this separate little man inside a separate little room.
So, I mean, we should give Berkeley some credit then, because he made a lot of sort of defendable moves, right? And they're also the kind of moves, some of them actually, rooted in different kinds of sort of mechanisms of exactly how they work. But we talk about vision and touch calibrating and informing each other, right? There's all research on how these things work together, and the notion of embodiment and the fact that the body plays a role in how perception works, for example, and the fact that your action, the way you move, shapes how you experience your superficially, there's a lot of kind of things in common. There's things that are quite familiar. It's just that sitting under the hood is 17th century physics again, right? It's still a bad guy.
I agree with you. The idea that exploration, and when we take in dynamic, it's going to solve a lot of problems for us. Yeah. That fundamentally is right. Doesn't quite work here. But, but I like, one of the things I think is good about this book is, like, an ecological psychologist, not like Gibson was locked in a room and went, Eureka! Like, he was building on, like every good scientist, building a lot of other people's ideas too. Didn't come out of nowhere, right? Or so. But I think that's great. I think Berkeley, there's some really important ideas. They didn't quite work here, but I think they're still right. This is the argument against illusions intercept, right? Why illusions? As soon as you can move around and look around and touch and think, illusions go away. Yeah,
absolutely.
Almost as soon as you move, doesn't it?
Yeah. And that's the whole point of being able to move around. Is that the ambiguity of the illusion is actually an artifact of being forced into a dumb situation. Yeah.
And we're sort of getting into invariance, Gibson's idea, right? What as we move, what doesn't change, right? That's a fundamental.
But again, like Berkeley doesn't have the vocabulary that allows him to get to the notion of something like an invariant over a transformation, for example. He's still looking at the pieces, at the elements of how the elements working together, and you don't get invariance in amongst the pieces. The pieces are the things that change, and the thing that is invariant is the relationship between those two. And then you have to have a story. Then you have to be able to tell a story about the relational structure that is invariant being the thing that you're interacting with, for example. And that's so again, Berkeley just. He quite clearly sees the shape of the problem that's facing him, and he goes after a reasonably sensible solution, but he can't build the whole story out of the tools that he has available to him. And he can't, and those tools are blocking him. They're stopping him from getting to the new stuff, right?
It did really make me think about, Andrew, when you said that, Gibson's ideas were very, very radical, and sometimes people don't really give credit or recognize how radical they were, because that was the first bit. Was I'm going to just get rid of all these 17th century geometry and start somewhere else. I mean, that's huge because nobody's done that to that point. They were all, like you say, still trying to solve the same problem. Step back and gone, actually, maybe I need to think about this completely differently. I mean, that was massive. And then the intentionality, like, why are we moving?
Yeah. But I think that it's the thing one of the things I've always really respected about Gibson is that, he would take an idea and then he would muck about with it and try and get the damn thing to work. But the thing that really made him a bit different was the fact that he really noticed when he couldn't get it to work. And he took that failure seriously. So like he started in the 1920s, his PhD was looking at trying to find, he was doing shape perception, I think. He was looking for how to recover invariant shape out of the things that were being projected to the retina. And he had all these experiments projecting things to retinas, right? Trying to identify. And the thing he realized was, his whole PhD is trying to get this to work. And he was basically like, no, it can't work. Like you just can't, you just can't do it. There's no basis for getting to this. And so, but instead of, the thing that made Gibson different was that he noticed when something wasn't working, or he noticed that when something couldn't work.
To stop trying to continue doing that whole.
And that's definitely the thing that's coming up again and again and again, is that you've got all these really smart people who keep running into problems and notice that something isn't working, but they never spot that their solution can't possibly work because they're so deep in the trench. And it's a perfectly legitimate place to be,
Yeah.
Because they had really good reasons for being deeply committed to the physics and the geometry and the things that were blinding them. So they had tons of good reasons for it. But yeah, there was something about Gibson that made him go.
Do you think some of it was Eleanor's work though? Because she was, while he's doing this, she's doing work on depth perception. And I got hold of her 1960 paper. I asked Keith for it in the end. I couldn't find it. Oh, you were going to my list. You do. Well, I gotta get hold of this paper. Is it the visual cliff or something? And the thing that she says about that is that depth perception, the ability to perceive death, to perceive death. The animals are getting it when they start to move around. So again, there's this, like that they don't, not from experience, not because they have near fatal falls.
Mm-hmm.
So the chicks, as soon as they're moving, the kittens, they can't perceive it until they move. Puppies, not till they move. Goats. She had rats that would normally be in the dark.
Yeah.
So she's doing all this stuff. So again, the depth perception, it's a different side of that, isn't it? That I kind of think there must be some stuff from there that maybe would have given, or he, because there's other information for him, isn't there? It's still, I'm not taking away from that, the real, radical is amazing. But I think, the work that they did together and that she did must have been really fascinating.
I have to have a look again.
Over, like bottle of wine must have been amazing.
Yeah, they must have had some good discussion.
They would have been amazing. Yeah.
Things about
that and complaining against the anti-nepotism rules of Cornell meant that she wasn't allowed a faculty gig.
Yeah.
But she wrote a biography or an autobiography actually. It's called Perceiving the Affordances, I think. I haven't read it for years, but yeah, she tells a lot of really interesting stories about, it's focused a lot on her, but obviously JJ's in there too. It'd be interesting to have a look in there again and see some of the stories about what was happening when the
ideas are coming. Yeah.
Looking at development, isn't she? And there's so many of the women, it's motor development, isn't it?
Kids.
Clark, Adolf,
That's the psychology rule, right? The guys do the science and the women do the babies, right? Like, isn't that?
But I think linking motor control to development is a huge.
Yeah, that's it. I think. Well,
I think
a lot of those people come out being forced to ask really hard questions. It's like, how do you learn this, right?
Gibson seemed to have a quality that I think all good, really amazing scientists have. They're kind of, I call it deliberately dumb.
Yeah.
Like, why? No. That we just hear a term and we're like, okay, I know what that means. No. What does that mean? Why does it have to be that way? It would be really. Also, I've said a few times, I think Bernstein also had the kind of the early application kind of pressure to apply these ideas.
Yeah.
That, I think, kind of shaped how they thought. But yeah,
that's true, because Gibson's right. His early work with the World War II pilots, right?
Yeah.
He's trying to figure out how to give a visual test to a pilot, or to a candidate pilot, to identify good ones given the visual. And he couldn't do it.
Keep them alive, of identify ones, because it was horrific, weren't they?
But nothing in vision science gave him the ability to create a test that told him a damn thing that was of any use.
Yeah.
Until, at least, and eventually he took people out onto like gun ranges and things like that and had them do all kinds of complicated, but there was no image-based test he could give anybody, so he moved to movies, and that helped. So that was a hint that actually, one of the things you have to worry about is No, that's interesting, Rob. I hadn't thought. I always forget that.
And Bernstein had to make blacksmiths
productivity
better. Right?
And was he doing Olympic athletes as well? I can't remember. Was Bernstein doing athletes?
Yeah, eventually. But yeah, I think that's a parallel they had, kind of.
Yeah.
I always say, like, my career, when I had to start applying things, it completely changed the way I think about things. But
I think that's why. I thought of her work because it's when animals start moving.
Mm-hmm.
Movement is clearly a really important part of the puzzle. If you read it, and now when I read it,
yes.
Like, you can see, actually, vision doesn't work until you can move.
And not just moving, but moving yourself. So there's a great paper. It's a very cute little paper, but it's called Travel Broadens the Mind, and it's just a little, almost like a review paper. I can't remember who wrote it, but basically they were just reviewing some of the literature where you do weird things to kittens, right? And you get kittens who They start
Oh,
moving
yeah.
themselves around versus you
Passively pulled around.
Yeah, you stick them in a little car and drive them around. And
Mhm.
passive versus it's
Yeah, it's a lot of rats.
Different brain
yeah.
development.
And so it's closing the perception action loop yourself, keeping them
Mhm.
coupled, but
With
also intentionality.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Intentionality is not peripheral to this. It's not accident. It's central.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the skill act thing suddenly goes poof, doesn't it? So, okay. You know, so mindless repetition is like almost like, you know, movement nonsense, isn't it?
Mhm.
The body.
Yeah, exactly. And like it sucks the purpose out of it. And actually, purpose. No, that's an interesting connection. I like that.
Yeah. Yeah, the fundamental, you know, you're creating, if we just stick to perception, you're creating relationships by the nature of your practice that won't be there. You're making non-specifying information useful for the tasks you're giving your athletes, which we can get that. That's coming down the road. But whereas
ahead of ourselves here.
Yeah, I think I agree with you, Marion. I think Eleanor was a bit ahead of him, I think, in thinking of perception for action.
Yeah.
She was really in kids crawling, right? She was kind of low and she just didn't care about depth perception. She cared about how the kids crawl and learn to walk. Stuff. So yeah, I think she was a big influence. They were both.
Yeah, and the research, the findings that she had, that when they changed their mode of locomotion, like went from, you know, crawling to walking, they had to learn that relationship again. They couldn't just take that, like, you know, the physics and the geometry that they already had on their eyes and apply it to it didn't work. They had to almost relearn. And that's pretty profound. These things he must have been thinking, you know, he's talking to her over their wine.
So I've got a video I just showed my class last week, and it's Karen Adolph, who was an EJ student, doing her locomotion stuff with the slopes and all this sort of stuff. And I can't remember. She was. It's from a documentary that she was featured in her lab. And then anyway, and so she's talking about the visual cliff stuff and EJ's development of this thing, and then looking at the different learning curves depending on not just the fact that you are moving, but the way in which you are moving. Right? There's, you know, crawling to cruising to walking are all actually dynamically very different modes of locomotion. And so the affordances change. What a slope affords changes with that, and you have to. You can become you can take a very skilled crawler who can crawl down a slope safely within a couple of degrees of their affordance boundary. And then they transition the next, you know, a couple of days later to cruising, and it's like they've never seen the slope before, right?
Yeah. So all of those things, I mean, they're fascinating. They would all be. I mean, I'm sure they would have all been influencing as he's thinking. This intractable, he's probably thinking
But yeah, I think these ideas some of them must appeal to him. They're definitely of Berkeley's. He quite solved it, but
Oh, that's interesting then, because I was just thinking, so the Gibson 66 book, I'm trying to remember how much action there is in the Gibson 66. He's obviously got movement.
Yeah, because her paper was 60, wasn't it? It's that visual thing.
And her book, EJ's first book is 69, I think. Interesting. I'll have to go dig out my copy of her biography and see if I can find any stories.
History together,
I need one. I need to put it on my Christmas list. Or for my Mother's Day. I want first edition of
so we're on the. I think we're getting to the precipice of more of Gibson pretty soon. What do we have coming up next? More space enigmas, right?
Lots more space enigmas.
Yeah. It was nice to dig in. It was nice to get into the movement bit, wasn't it? I mean, as much as I like philosophy, it's almoys like got to that chapter went, this is
we're getting into now information and action. It was a little more my wheelhouse than physics and philosophy and
Yeah, but remember, the lesson of all of this is that we have to at least try
Yeah.
to understand a little bit of it, because we're
For
on the
sure.
hook for it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like, you're not. There's a quote, a note in here that Turvey says something along the lines of, your theory of space perception depends entirely on your theory of what space is.
Yes.
Right? You can't build a theory of space perception until you have a notion of what you think space is.
Mhm.
And so Euclidean geometry had provided us with a notion of what space is. And so therefore you tried to build your theory of perception out of that, right? And that's and so on and so on. But when Gibson talks about space, he doesn't talk about it in those terms at all, right? He talks about surfaces and layouts and all that sort of stuff. And so space becomes not space, but it's ground theory, right?
Yeah.
Opposed to air theory. It's like, I can't remember if that was a Gibson phrase or if Jeff Bingham just invented that for his class. But
I like that. Which is why he doesn't start the book with the eye.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, you need to understand. What we're interacting with first. Yeah. Okay. Any other things from that? I think we covered. There's obviously more nitty gritty, but
Yeah, there's loads of nitty gritty. But I think we've covered the sort of the point of these.
Yeah.
And I think we've covered the key parts. It might feel worth doing some recapping a bit as we go through. Like have to flip back and go, okay, what's this come from? Because we're going through each chapter, aren't we? He's giving us little bits that it can be quite easy then to start forgetting.
Yes.
But yes, we're going. I think yes. I think you're right. I think we'll get to the point.
Yeah.
Well, there'll be after maybe 10 or 12 chapters, there might be an episode of us just going, right, what happened?
What did I do? Flipping through pages. Yeah.
So a quick recap.
Yeah.
But yeah, so in my head, it's like we've got this, like you say, the 19th century physics, geometry, that's been taken as being absolute. It's a non-changing environment as well. I think that's the other thing, isn't it? And then we have an organism with no intentionality, brain body divide, trying to make sense of
trying to read
information.
Yeah.
And then
all this.
It goes, actually, we need to change the ingredients.
Yeah.
And start again.
I appreciate how he rolls philosophy in with all of this and that connects it.
Yeah. And I think if we think about what's going on in cognitive psychology as well as ecological psychology, and I was reading this, I started getting a bit grumpy about like why it's like the animal world's nobody talking about this. Like it's not like Eleanor Gibson didn't do where this theories didn't come from looking at animals as well, and Kelsall was doing all the stuff in coordination dynamics on quadrupeds, including horses, dogs, and other animals like that. And yet that just seems to be completely missed, So I had a little bit of frustration about that. But and again, thinking it's really important to understand where these thoughts come from, because essentially, otherwise we're a man in the room just with the TV going, like, we've taken all of this as being true, and we don't know whether it is, and we're not questioning it.
Yeah, I think that's always been a kind of a strength of ecological science. Frustratingly, that's why we have to start every paper by explaining relative to traditional, here's where we are, but you can't just jump in and start talking about our own theory.
Exactly. It's like, and the same with movement, okay, they don't have to talk about motor programs and things like that. You just start at the point that everyone's agreed on.
I've tried in later years just to write papers where I just jump in and I don't do all the apologizing at the beginning. It's really hard to write them. Yeah. And reviewers do often go, but what about this?
Yeah.
And I was like, yes, I know it. It's just not what the paper's about,
Yeah, I remember when I was editing JP, the journal, Carl Newell would submit some papers, and he'd always use education of attention, and the reviewers' minds would be, what is it? Is it spotlight of attention? Like they would, it would be such a, what is that? They had a very different view of what attention meant, so we had to kind of.
Yeah.
It was frustrating.
EJ wrote a paper with JJ ages ago, just laying it out. It's not a hard concept.
Yeah. for sure. So yeah, but we're getting there. But yeah.
Yeah.
I just put up sometimes now I attempt to just put up a slide with a Kool-Aid symbol and say, okay, you've all drunk the Kool-Aid about ecological psychology. I'm not going to justify it anymore. I know.
When I put together the proposal for my PhD, and I sent it obviously not to Keith and others, but to somebody else, I literally got this thing back going, oh, that's absolutely amazing. But you can't just make up all of the, you can't make up ecological dynamics. You can't make up complexity.
Actually, no, you should take that as a compliment. It's like, for a PhD proposal, you've just invented
a whole of skill.
Well, congratulations, that's amazing.
Somebody who had a student who was doing some stuff that was said dynamical, and they were like they quoted some of or referenced some of Kelsey, like that Lagarde paper that that Kelsey was involved with, looking at in phase, basically movement phase with humans and horses.
Mm-hmm.
And I said to them, well, what do you think he's talking about here in dynamical systems? And this person said, I thought it meant that the horse and rider were moving instead of standing still.
Right.
Well, I don't want you as my supervisor. I was like, oh God. I was like, why did you keep asking me all these questions? So honestly, somebody was saying to me, you can't just make all this up and expect to then just start a PhD as if it's
make up your own theory. Okay.
Well, it's all right. You can just point people to these podcasts now and say, I'm not making it up.
Somebody
else made it
work we're doing came from somewhere. Yeah.
Flattered, but
Maybe we'll wrap it up there, guys. We've gone off a tangent at the end. But yeah, so next time we got 2 more enigmas, space enigmas.
Yeah, 2 more attempts to solve the problem that are going to fail miserably.
Yeah.
Yeah, lots of intriguing titles to come. Oh, they got another space enigma coming too. There's still more. Yep. So hopefully you'll stick with us, and I'm fine. I think it's really useful. I think I'm not the best at following history of this kind of work, so it's useful for me.
Yeah,
that's something I have a strong desire to do, to understand when something started and
and why and what it is that they were influenced by and thinking, and I like that like Ed Baggs said on my podcast, he wanted to know what Gibson was likely to have been reading and thinking about and understand his perspective, because we're looking at Gibson from a completely different place.
Yeah.
To what it is. So I found that interesting. I also need to ask him whether he got past chapter 8 after telling me that he...
We'll see. Well, we're almost there. We're
coming in.
First run. We're not going to be able. No one's going to be able to cheat by reading this post pretty soon. But
yeah, thank you. I'm enjoying it, and it's good to have the discipline of just going. I'm just going to read 2 chapters and pay attention.
Yeah, it's a manageable size. Excellent.
Okay, guys.
Thanks
for everyone. We'll talk to you later.